The cold came for Pinehurst, Montana, on the night of January 6, 1888, and it came without mercy. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours, plummeting from a mild 20 above zero to 20 below by midnight, then continuing its descent into depths that the mercury thermometers could not measure because the mercury itself had frozen solid in the tubes. The old-timers would later estimate that the temperature reached 55 below zero before dawn, cold so profound that it cracked window glass, split tree trunks with sounds like rifle shots, and turned the breath of any living creature into a cloud of ice crystals that fell tinkling to the ground. The wooden houses of Pinehurst had not been built for such cold. They had been built quickly, cheaply, with single-layer walls and inadequate chinking, designed for the moderate winters that Montana usually provided. Now those walls were bleeding heat faster than any stove could replace it, the gaps between boards becoming highways for air that felt like liquid nitrogen, the homes transforming from shelters into slow-motion death traps. By dawn, the first casualties were being discovered. Old Mrs. Brennan, found frozen in her bed with 3 quilts pulled up to her chin, her stove gone cold sometime in the night. The Johansson infant, dead in his cradle despite being wedged between his parents, his small body unable to maintain warmth against cold that adults could barely survive. Thomas Pickett, the young schoolteacher who had boarded at the Halverson place, found sitting upright in a chair as if he had simply fallen asleep, his book still open on his lap, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. The count would reach 11 before the cold snap broke 4 days later. 11 souls taken by a winter that had turned murderous. 11 lives lost in houses that had proven utterly inadequate against the fury of a Montana January. But on the eastern edge of town, where the land rose gently toward the foothills, a different scene was unfolding. Magnus Headland opened the door of his home, a door set into a hillside, surrounded by sod and earth, leading into a dwelling that was half underground, and looked out at a world that had become hostile to human life. The temperature inside his house was 58 degrees. His fire had burned all night, yes, but it had burned low, using perhaps a quarter of the fuel that his neighbors were desperately shoveling into stoves that could not keep pace with the cold. The walls of his home were not bleeding heat because they were not exposed to the wind. They were buried, insulated by 3 feet of earth that maintained a constant temperature regardless of what the air above was doing. He watched his breath plume white in the doorway, felt the shocking cold strike his face, and understood what was happening in the wooden houses of Pinehurst. They would be dying in there. They would be burning their furniture, their books, their floorboards, anything that would catch flame. And still the cold would be winning because their homes had been built for comfort, not survival. His dapple gray gelding, Thunder, nickered from the stable that adjoined his dwelling, also half buried, also warm, also protected by the earth that everyone had said was foolish to dig into. "They'll come soon," Magnus said quietly, his Swedish accent still audible after 15 years in America. "When the cold breaks and they see who lived and who died, they'll come." He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it with the weariness of a man who had tried to warn them, who had shown them what he was building and why, who had watched them laugh and turn away and build their wooden boxes while he burrowed into the earth like the primitive creature they believed him to be. Now they would understand. But understanding would come too late for the 11 who were already gone. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the northern country, the mountains, or somewhere the cold cuts just as deep. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the only warm house belongs to the man they called a mole. Magnus had come to Montana in the spring of 1873, a man of 31 who had fled Sweden not for gold or land, but for the simple freedom to build as he chose. In his homeland, he had been a builder, a craftsman who specialized in the traditional earth-sheltered homes that Scandinavians had constructed for centuries. These homes, called jordkällare in Swedish, use the insulating properties of earth to maintain stable temperatures year-round, staying cool in summer and warm in winter with minimal fuel consumption. But Sweden was changing. The old ways were being abandoned in favor of modern wooden construction, and builders like Magnus were being told their skills were obsolete. When he argued that earth-sheltered homes were superior for cold climates, he was dismissed as backward, a relic clinging to peasant techniques that had no place in a progressive society. America, he had thought, would be different. America was a land of freedom, where a man could build as he pleased on his own property. He had filed a claim on 160 acres in the Montana foothills, paid his fees, and begun construction on the home that would prove everything his critics had denied. The design was simple but elegant. He had chosen a south-facing hillside with good drainage, had excavated into the slope to create a level floor, and had constructed walls of stone against the earth bank. The front wall, the only wall exposed to the elements, was built thick, 18 inches of stone with small, deep-set windows that admitted light while minimizing heat loss. The roof was timber, covered with a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then buried under 3 feet of sod and earth that blended seamlessly into the hillside above. From the outside, the home was nearly invisible. A door in a hillside, a few windows peeking from the earth, a chimney rising from what appeared to be natural ground. From the inside, it was a marvel of efficiency. Warm in winter, cool in summer, resistant to wind and fire, and every other threat that the Montana wilderness could conjure. The stable he built adjacent, using the same principles, stone walls against the excavated hillside, earth-covered roof, a space where his horse could shelter in temperatures that would kill livestock exposed to the elements. The work took 2 years, 2 years of digging and hauling stone and laying timber and shoveling earth onto roofs that most people would have covered with wooden shingles. 2 years of solitary labor while his neighbors built their wooden homes in a matter of weeks and wondered what the crazy Swede was doing with all that dirt. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The people of Pinehurst had noticed his project immediately, and they had not understood it. Cornelius Whiting was the wealthiest man in the district, owner of the sawmill that provided lumber to most of the homesteaders in the region. He was a tall, imposing figure who had made his fortune selling wood, and he viewed Magnus's earth-sheltered construction as a personal insult. "The Swede is building a burrow," Whiting announced at his sawmill one afternoon, where homesteaders gathered to purchase lumber and exchange gossip. "Digging into the hillside like a badger. He'll be living in a hole in the ground while the rest of us have proper homes." The mockery had been immediate and sustained. Magnus was building a den, a warren, a cave. He was too primitive to understand modern construction, too backward to appreciate the superiority of wood-frame buildings with their straight walls and peaked roofs. The fact that he was choosing to live in dirt was evidence of a deficiency in character or intelligence, or both. Fletcher Moody, who ran the general store and fancied himself a wit, coined the nickname that would stick for the next decade. "The Mole Man," he called Magnus, and soon everyone was using it. The Mole Man and his burrow, the Swede who lived in a hole. Magnus had heard the mockery and said nothing. His English was serviceable but accented, and he had learned that accents made Americans assume stupidity. Better to stay silent and let his work speak for him than to argue with people who had already decided not to listen. He had tried, once, to explain the principles behind his design. When Reverend Josiah Crum had visited his claim to assess his spiritual condition, Magnus had walked him through the partially completed home, showing him how the earth moderated temperature, how the stone walls absorbed and radiated heat, how the design required a fraction of the fuel that wooden houses consumed. The Reverend had listened politely and departed with the assessment that Magnus was a simple soul, doing his best with limited understanding. The condescension had stung more than the outright mockery. By the summer of 1875, the home was complete. Magnus moved in, hung curtains in his deep-set windows, built fires in his stone hearth, and settled into a dwelling that maintained 60 degrees in winter and 65 in summer, without any of the temperature swings that plagued his neighbors' wooden boxes. He invited them to visit. He showed anyone who was interested how the design worked, why the earth provided such effective insulation, how the south-facing orientation captured winter sun through the windows while the roof overhang blocked the summer sun. A few came out of curiosity, looked around, and departed unconvinced. "It's like living in a cave," declared Mrs. Whiting, who had accompanied her husband on one such visit. "Dark and damp and primitive. I don't know how you stand it." The house was neither dark nor damp. The windows provided adequate light, and the drainage Magnus had installed kept the interior dry. But facts made no impression on opinions already formed. The Whitings returned to their grand wooden house, the finest in Pinehurst, and continued to view Magnus's dwelling as evidence of his inferiority. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now back to the story. The years passed, and Magnus's home proved itself through every season. The winters were comfortable. He burned perhaps a cord of wood each year, while his neighbors burned 4 or 5. The summers were pleasant, while wooden houses became sweltering ovens in July and August. His earth-sheltered dwelling remained cool and livable. The violent thunderstorms that occasionally swept through the territory, bringing hail, high winds, and even tornadoes, passed over his buried roof without effect, while wooden buildings lost shingles and sometimes walls. He kept records, as he kept records of everything: temperature inside versus temperature outside, fuel consumption compared to his neighbors, maintenance required over time. The data showed clearly what his experience confirmed. The earth-sheltered design was superior in almost every measurable way. No one wanted to see the data. No one wanted to hear about thermal mass and insulation values and the principles that had guided Scandinavian builders for centuries. The Mole Man lived in his hole, and the people of Pinehurst lived in their proper homes, and that was the natural order of things. The winter of 1887 to 88 began mild. December brought moderate cold and light snow, the kind of winter that Montana usually provided. Challenging but manageable for those with adequate fuel and sound construction. The wooden houses of Pinehurst performed adequately, their stoves keeping pace with the moderate cold, their walls holding against winds that were brisk but not brutal. Then January arrived. The cold snap that descended on Montana in the second week of January 1888 was not ordinary winter weather. It was a polar vortex, a mass of Arctic air that had broken free from its usual containment and plunged south with temperatures that belonged to the far north of Canada, not the relatively temperate valleys of Montana. Weathermen would later classify it as a once-in-a-century event, a statistical anomaly that could not have been predicted or planned for. Magnus had planned for it anyway. He had stockpiled firewood, not because he needed much, but because he knew his neighbors would run short. He had stored extra food, extra blankets, extra everything that people might need if the winter turned severe. His earth-sheltered home, designed to survive the worst that Scandinavian winters could produce, was more than adequate for Montana's version of extreme cold. On the night of January 6th, when the temperature began its fatal plunge, Magnus was reading by his fire, comfortable in shirt sleeves, unaware that the outside world was becoming hostile to human life. He learned of the crisis the next morning, when the first refugee arrived at his door. It was young Peter Halverson, the 14-year-old son of the family that had housed the schoolteacher. The boy had walked a mile through 50-below temperatures, his face white with frost, his words tumbling out in clouds of frozen breath. "Mr. Headland," Peter gasped, "the teacher is dead, frozen in his chair. My father says if we don't find warmer shelter, we'll all be dead by nightfall. Our stove can't keep up. The cold is coming through the walls." Magnus pulled the boy inside, wrapped him in blankets, sat him by the fire that had been burning low, but still maintained the room at 58 degrees. "How many in your family?" Magnus asked. "7. My parents, 5 children. Bring them here, now, before it gets colder." The Halversons arrived within the hour. Mother, father, 5 children ranging from 6 to 16, all of them shaking with cold despite wearing every piece of clothing they owned. They stepped through Magnus's door and stopped, staring, unable to believe what their bodies were telling them. "It's warm," whispered Mrs. Halverson. "How is it warm?" "The earth," Magnus said simply. "The earth does not freeze. The cold cannot reach through 3 feet of soil." Word spread. By nightfall, 17 people had crowded into Magnus's home. The Halversons, the Brennans, those who survived. The widow Morrison and her 3 children, others who had heard that the mole man's burrow was somehow warmer than any building in Pinehurst. They sat on the floor. They leaned against the stone walls that radiated gentle warmth. They breathed air that did not freeze their lungs, and they survived. The next day brought more. Families who had burned their last stick of furniture, families whose children were showing the blue-tinged lips of hypothermia, families who had watched elderly relatives slip away in the night and were determined not to follow. Magnus's home filled to capacity, 30 people, then 40, then 53 at its peak, packed shoulder to shoulder in spaces designed for one man and his horse. He moved Thunder to the farthest corner of the stable and made room for the livestock of the refugees: 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, 3 goats that someone had carried through the snow rather than leave to freeze. The animal heat added to the warmth of the earth-sheltered structure, raising the temperature despite the crowds, maintaining conditions that were merely uncomfortable rather than deadly. The cold snap lasted 4 days. 4 days of temperatures that never rose above 30 below zero. 4 days of wind that drove the effective temperature even lower. 4 days during which the wooden houses of Pinehurst became uninhabitable, their walls cracking, their stoves failing, their occupants fleeing or dying where they sat. 11 people died, those who had not reached shelter in time, those who had refused to leave their homes, those who had not believed the cold could be as bad as it was. But 53 people lived, crowded into a half-buried house that everyone had called a hole, surviving because a man they had mocked for 15 years had known something they refused to learn. The thaw came on January 10th, a relative thaw, temperatures rising to a merely brutal 10 below zero, warm enough that the survivors could begin to assess what had happened. They emerged from Magnus's home into a world that had changed. The damage was catastrophic. The wooden houses of Pinehurst had been ravaged by the cold. Cracked walls, burst pipes, destroyed foundations where frost heaving had lifted structures off their footings. The finest house in town, the Whiting mansion that had represented the pinnacle of modern construction, was a ruin. Cornelius Whiting himself had survived only because he had swallowed his pride on the second night and led his family to the mole man's burrow. The gathering came 2 weeks later, held in the only building large enough to accommodate the survivors. Magnus's earth-sheltered home, expanded with a tent extension for the overflow. The people of Pinehurst assembled to reckon with what had happened, to mourn the dead, and to acknowledge the man who had saved them. Cornelius Whiting spoke first. The sawmill owner, the man who had led the mockery of Magnus's construction, stood before the community he had helped mislead with the humility of someone whose pride had nearly killed his family. "I called this man the Mole Man," Whiting said, his voice thick with shame. "I said he was living in a hole, that his construction was primitive, that anyone who chose dirt over lumber was too backward to know better." He stopped, struggling to continue. "My house, the finest house in Pinehurst, built with the best lumber my mill could produce, nearly killed my family. We burned everything we could burn, and still the cold came through the walls. We would have died if this man had not opened his hole to us." He turned to Magnus. "I was wrong about you, about your methods, about everything. The hole I mocked saved my children's lives. The primitive construction I dismissed was the only thing in this town that worked." Others spoke. The Halversons, whose youngest child had been turning blue when they arrived at Magnus's door. The widow Morrison, whose husband had died 2 winters before, who had nearly lost her children to the cold that took the schoolteacher. The families who had crowded into a space designed for one and emerged alive because the earth had protected them when wooden walls could not. When the testimonies were complete, Magnus rose and walked to the center of the gathering. He was not comfortable with public speaking. His accent still made him self-conscious, and the mockery he had endured had made him wary of sharing his thoughts. But some things needed to be said. "In Sweden," he began, "my people have built this way for 1,000 years. We call them jordkällare, earth houses. We learned that the ground holds warmth, that buried walls do not freeze, that the earth itself is the best protection against winter." He looked around the room at faces that had laughed at him, pitied him, dismissed him. "I tried to show you. I tried to explain why I was building this way. You did not want to understand. You wanted me to build like you, to buy lumber from Mr. Whiting's mill, to live in a proper house that would be cold in winter and hot in summer, and require endless fuel to maintain." He paused. 11 people died this week. Good people, neighbors, friends. They died because the houses they trusted could not protect them against cold that my house handled easily. I do not blame them. I do not blame you. But I want you to understand that this—" He gestured at the stone walls, the earth-covered roof, the dwelling that had saved 53 lives—"is not primitive. It is not backward. It is wisdom earned over centuries that your modern methods have forgotten." He drew a breath. "I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The techniques are not complicated. The materials are free: earth, stone, timber that does not need to be milled. Any family here can build an earth-sheltered home, or at least an earth-sheltered room, where they can shelter when the cold comes again." He looked at Cornelius Whiting. "It will come again. Perhaps not this year, perhaps not next year, but the cold will return because that is what cold does. The question is whether Pinehurst will be ready." Thank you for watching this story about Magnus Headland and the earth-sheltered home of Pinehurst. When we mock what we do not understand, we sometimes lose the wisdom that might save us. If this story reminded you that the old ways carry knowledge the new ways have forgotten, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed your methods as primitive until the day those methods proved essential? That summer, 17 earth-sheltered structures were built across the Pinehurst area, some complete homes, others emergency shelters attached to existing buildings, all following the principles that Magnus had demonstrated through 15 years of patient example. He supervised each construction, teaching the techniques his grandfather had taught him, adapting Scandinavian methods to Montana conditions. Cornelius Whiting sold his ruined mansion and built an earth-sheltered home on the same property, using timber from his own mill for the roof structure, but burying it under 3 feet of sod like Magnus had shown him. He never again mocked the methods that had saved his family, and he never again called Magnus the Mole Man. The phrase "building warm" entered the vocabulary of the Montana Territory. It meant constructing with the earth rather than against it, using the ground's stable temperature to maintain comfort, rather than fighting the elements with fuel and insulation that would never be adequate against the worst that winter could bring. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned through nearly freezing to death. Magnus Headland lived in his earth-sheltered home for another 38 years, passing in the winter of 1926 at the age of 84. He married in 1890, a widow named Ingrid, whose first husband had died in the cold snap of 88. And together they raised 4 children who all learned to build the old way before they learned anything else. His home still stands. The earth-covered roof has been replaced twice, and the stone walls have been repointed once, but the structure is sound as it was when Magnus completed it in 1875, as warm in winter and cool in summer as it was the day the first fire was lit in its hearth. The Montana Historical Society maintains it now, offering tours to visitors who want to understand how the pioneers survived in a land that seemed determined to kill them. Above the door, carved in letters that Magnus added in the years after the Great Cold, is an inscription in both Swedish and English: "Jordan Skidar, the earth protects." His grandfather, who had taught him to build this way in a country half a world away, would have recognized the truth in those words and smiled to see how far the knowledge had traveled.